And now we are moving to Günther Schefbeck from Austrian Parliament. I remind that Austrian Parliament, I recall to our mind that Austrian Parliament was one of the first in Europe to adopt XML with the modification of the Constitution. Happened, if I is correct, in 2001. So very advanced technology adopted since the beginning. And so Professor Günther Schefbeck can show us the Austrian Parliament lawmaking system based on XML and the digitalization.
Thank you, Monica. Dear colleagues, dear friends, when being invited to present what Austria 20 years ago, it's exactly 20 years ago this year, has done to put its legislative workflow on an electronic basis, you can easily imagine I have to look back to history. 20 years ago, Accomondoso was not yet there. There were no standards in the field of supporting lawmaking, so we had to customize a solution. In those days, in the first decade of this century, actually the Austrian example was inspiring some other parliaments in developing their own solutions. Meanwhile, of course, it's no longer a solution that in any way can be copied, can be taken over, but still, I could imagine we can take some conclusions from it. We can learn from the procedure we have taken, and we also can talk a little bit about what's going on now, even in our parliament, and that's why Monica also invited me to make a few words about a project that we have just finished, the ManyLaws project that has already been mentioned today several times, which might provide you with a few ideas about what's going on and about what will happen in the future. Going back to our Austrian e-law system, as we are calling it, e-Recht in German, e-law in English, it simply replaced this traditional style of producing legal enactments by an electronic style. So the idea was to put the whole legislative workflow on an electronic basis, and I would like to put this idea within the framework of a very brief overview of the impact that IT generally had on managing legislative processes. Then I will make a very few words about the Austrian example. I won't go into technical details. This would not be valuable to you anymore. I will just make a few remarks on the general technical approaches. Looking back to history, already in the 1970s, IT started to have an impact on legislation, but in an ex post view. Only the laws produced by Parliament were ingested in the first databases whose objective was to document the law in force. In the following decade, legislative processes started to be documented, and in the 1990s, with the availability of the internet, a totally new approach of how to make parliamentary information available to the public came into being. Only around 20 years ago, the legislative processes themselves started to be electronified when workflow management was introduced, and the output of the parliamentary process or of the legislative process particularly became published authentically in an electronic format. In the past decade, new approaches have come up, like the introduction of linked open data, like producing consolidated versions in an automated way, the introduction of semantic approaches And in particular, and this is the great advantage that we have received from Monica and her team, standardization. Standardization in particular when it comes to legislative formats. We have learned about Accomantoso a lot this week. So nowadays, a solution has to be based on a standard format in practice on Accomantoso if it wants to be up to date. What will happen in the next years? Artificial intelligence is coming up more and more, and you will see from the ManyLaws project what it can be used for today. Of course, the options for the future are unimaginable. So in 10 or 20 years from now, AI will have changed everything. Blockchain was a hype a few years ago. Meanwhile, this hype has gone down a little bit. It has also been discussed whether blockchain could be introduced to legislative processes. The first enthusiasm is over for many reasons, not only because it's so energy consuming, but artificial intelligence anyway will dominate the next decade. So in this path that I've briefly described, we developed first what might be called information management systems, then workflow management systems, and tried to improve different qualities of legislation, of the legislative procedure, of the legislative output, and even the participatory quality of legislation by developing tools to include the general public, to include civil society in legislative processes, which meant these processes were to be modeled, starting from what might be called descriptive modeling for information management systems. Then when we were introducing workflow management systems, we also introduced prescriptive modeling, which also included that some traditional aspects of legislative procedures had to be amended, had to be changed, which is not always difficult in a conservative environment like parliaments, but in the end, the advantages were visible to everybody. So this process re-engineering will remain a subject in every parliament that introduces new or better systems to digitally support legislation. Nowadays, we have still in some parliaments plain information systems. We have mixed systems that would also introduce some aspects of communication and transactions. And more parliaments nowadays would have fully electronic workflow systems. Look back to the examples we have listened to today. Another view on the present situation might be the view from the organizational variety. In bicameral systems, we still have isolated systems, but we also have overall systems of these parliaments. In unicameral systems of parliamentary systems, of course, this is not a subject of debate, but it becomes more and more important to integrate all organs involved in the legislative process, which in particular means administration, the administrative agencies involved in that process. But more and more, we are also discussing about how to integrate the other actors, for example, NGOs, or even individual members of civil society that also may have their say in the legislative process, how to integrate these actors in the legislative process through electronic environments. I promised you I will be very brief talking about our e-law project, but what I should explicitly make you aware of is how we were able to convince our political decision makers. That's in fact an issue that civil servants always are facing when trying to introduce new technical approaches or procedural approaches. They need to convince their political decision makers. And the best argument always is saving money. That's what I can tell you from my professional experience of 35 years. So we were able to convince our political decision makers by telling them, by introducing such a workflow system, providing full support to the whole parliamentary process, we would be able to save money by simply saving the printing costs for the Federal Law Gazette. Because then we could, without any problem or without any risk, go over to authentic electronic publishing of the federal laws in Austria. I always have to mention it's Austrian political system is a federal system, so we're talking about federal legislation here. Provincial legislation only years later also introduced systems like the federal one. The development, as you can see from this slide, was a quick one. After the political decision was made in June 2001, already on 1st January 2002, we had a workflow system operational, because we were able to base the system on existing workflow components on the administrative side as well as the parliamentary side that we just had to put together. So it was actually a system breach that had to be overcome by interfaces, which was not a technical issue at all. But, and this was most important, and that's the second lesson learned I would try to convey to you after the lesson learned about how to convince politicians. This lesson learned is it's most important to avoid format breaches. We had learned that from the Swiss Parliament that we had studied in preparing our system, and they actually had a format breach between their government agencies and their parliament, so that they had to reformat the documents again and again. That was why most work of the working group that I'm mentioning on my slide, the working group that was established by the Austrian Federal Chancellery, which is something like a Prime Minister's office in Austria, and the parliamentary administration, was to agree on a common production format. And actually, and now that's the big surprise, but it's not a surprise when you are making yourself aware of us talking about 2001, 20 years ago. As a production format, we had to choose Word, because in those days there was no usable XML editor available. As exchange and storage format, of course, already then we decided to choose XML, so that we had to develop a conversion routine which was supported by a macro solution for Word, forcing the legislative drafters to use the correct formats, which then made it easily possible to do the conversion to XML. So as I mentioned, I won't go into technical details here, just to save time. This is the way of federal legislation, which then within our new environment was fully supported electronically. Electronic support in the following years was also extended to the pre-parliamentary stages of the legislative process from 2007 on. Also, the draft bills drafted at the ministerial level started to be integrated in our system. So that's just a few screenshots, a few words about the complexity we had to face when modeling the parliamentary proceedings, not the pre-parliamentary stages, just the parliamentary ones. We came up with around 1,000 different types of procedural steps. So you can imagine it was quite a complex system that we had to develop. We were able to do a little bit of processor engineering, but as I mentioned before, Parliament is a conservative environment, so we still had to take over most of these types of procedural steps that we identified. And of course, we also are facing a certain substantial complexity. Nowadays, we would call it big data, which is a term that was not in use 20 years ago. So it's simply a lot of documents that we have to deal with. just one figure. It's around 2,000 pages of legal enactment per year that we have to produce and to process. So here you have a diagram giving you a little idea of how the parliamentary workflow has been modeled electronically. Now, knowing that behind this simple diagram there are 1,000 different process steps, you can imagine that this diagram is extremely reductionist. I just would like to mention here that we also integrated parliamentary legislative initiatives into the system, so we are not just, were from the beginning, not just focusing on government bills. Just one view of how we are producing the documents within this Word environment that I mentioned before, supported by the Word macro, supporting the particular styles, legislative styles that we identified. Actually, in the working group, we came up with more than 100, around 120 different layout styles we would need, but it was clear that this would be a little bit complex, so we were able to reduce the number of these styles to about 90. And these 90 different layout styles are still in place today. So we have one template for all the different kinds of documents that we are working with, from government bills to committee reports and so on. And within this one template, around 90 different styles are supported in the Word environment, where it would be easily possible to assign certain layout styles to certain structural elements. So now here you have the bridge from layout to structure, which is of course the most important bridge that we need for being able to produce useful structured XML documents. A few lessons learned, so to say. We were able to significantly accelerate the lawmaking process because these long phases in between, when paper documents had to be printed, prepared and printed, were disappearing. Parliamentary business became immediately available, not only to the MPs and their assistants, but also to the general public. We were able to produce new kinds of business, like consolidated legal enactments, which also contributed to making legislation more transparent. And fulfilling promise, we were able to save more than €1 million per year, simply on the parliamentary side. The cost savings on the administrative side are not contained in that amount. So it was even more. Which actually meant that after one year, we had got back the money that we invested into the system. Finally, from the 1st January of 2004 on, authentic electronic promulgation of all federal laws came into place. It was necessary to produce a new federal law allowing for authentic electronic promulgation, which was done in 2003. And then from 1st January 2004 on, Austria was the first European country to have its legislation authentically published in an electronic format. That's briefly how it looks like. This is a portal that is operated by the Federal Chancellery, where several versions, some non-authentic ones and one authentic one, of the federal laws is published. You can check the authenticity here, and this is the authentic version. Until 2017, it was an XHTML version, and since 2017, it's a signed PDF version that constitutes this authentic electronic publication. I promised you not to go into detail. I just would like to state again that the XML schema that we produced is a totally customized one, just for the practical issues that we had to solve. So no model that anyone can copy, but it was sufficient to meet the requirements that we have to meet in all cases like this, namely to make sure that we have authentic legal documents, that their integrity is secured, and that they will be retrievable in a long-term perspective. By using XML, which I don't have to tell you much about after this week, and safe electronic signatures. What might this system that we have developed be useful today? To what extent might this system that we have developed be useful today? It still might, to some extent, serve as a reference model, because the practical issues that we had to tackle, like building bridges between the different actors in the legislative process, are issues that everyone having similar issue to settle is facing. So that's why in 2011, together with a friend who also was technically involved in the project, I produced a paper that would try to design something like a reference model legislative workflow based on our experiences, which I can't go into detail here, of course, but you can see that we modeled the main elements that a workflow like this would have to comprise, like a workflow system, an editor, and an open archive. And you can have a look at this paper from 2011 if you'd like to know more. The most important development since then was standardization. And this, of course, is represented by Akomantoso better than by anything else. And you already know about the advantages like interoperability that we have been talking about today so much, and cost efficiency, of course, as the most important argument that you need to make use of when convincing your decision makers. But nowadays, having a system like this, in Austria, we have this 20-year-old legacy system, which is still working well without any issues. So it's no visible reason for the decision makers to have it replaced by another system. But in our political environment, we have new challenges that can be tackled by new approaches. And here, artificial intelligence comes in. In a complex process like the legislative one, in which so many different actors are involved, information requirements are growing more and more. In particular, in a globalizing economic system, in particular in a political system that more and more, even at the national level, is coined by the decisions made at the European level, so that the European jurisdiction more and more overlaps with the national jurisdictions. And of course, in this integrating Europe, we are also looking beyond the national borders to what other member states are doing, how they are implementing European legal acts, or how they are producing national legal acts. So these information requirements nowadays can be met and will be met by artificial intelligence-based systems analyzing the different big legal data that are coming from the European and the national levels, and that are very difficult to be analyzed intellectually, of course, in particular because of the language issue. So that was the reason why we, as parliaments, the Hellenic Parliament and the Austrian Parliament, became part of the ManyLaws consortium. So in these final few minutes, I will tell you a little bit about the ManyLaws project. This is the scenario that we had in mind, how a system like ManyLaws would be able to provide information support to the different actors in the legislative processes, the MPs, their assistants, the Parliamentary Research Service, the committee secretaries in Parliament, but of course also to the members of civil society. Decisions, political decisions, of course, are always made under a certain level of uncertainty. But if we want to have evidence-based political decisions, legal decisions made, then we need to improve the level of information and reduce the level of uncertainty. And this may be done by a system like the one we had on our minds when trying to bring together legal information from the European level as well as the national levels of the European Union, and finding ways to make these legal data interoperable by transcending, in particular, the language borders, but of course also the semantic borders through the different markups that would come with these data from legal data from different systems within one environment that we call ManyLaws. So the idea was to provide real specific interfaces for political decision makers, for administrative staff, and of course a general interface for the general public, providing them with different kinds of information about legal documents, about legal processes, legal procedures, and even civil society discussions on legal issues from the European and the national levels of the European Union. Of course, I can't go into detail here, but of course, I'm open to your questions and to a later discussion about to what extent we achieved this aim. Of course, as it is the case in any project, we achieved this aim only to a certain extent. Within a project that was running from October 2018 to March 2021, with these 5 partners, the University of the Aegean as the coordinator, the Danube University Krems. Krems is a little city in Austria with a university which is focusing on postgraduate studies, Intersoft International as the software provider, and the 2 parliaments that I've already mentioned, the Hellenic one and the Austrian one. Funding came from the Connecting Europe facility, and what we tried in a few words was to apply artificial intelligence, or more specifically text mining algorithms, on this big legal data coming from these different jurisdictions to provide trans-jurisdictional and in particular translingual legal information. So one important approach was to use automatic translation to provide what might be called working translations of these legal documents. Of course, they can't be authentic. That's totally evident, but it's a useful first approach to these texts, which otherwise would be difficult to understand because written in a language other than one's native one. A brief view of the architecture. So this is the usual processing pipeline that you probably will know from other projects too, where at a lot of different steps we extract metadata from the data that we receive, where we try to automatically generate metadata following standards, like, for example, the standard thesaurus of European legislation, which is called Eurovoc, and finally transform the data into different formats, where, of course, we are following the current standards again. As far as the metadata are concerned, we put together 3 metadata standards into one ManyLaws metadata schema. And of course, one of these 3 was Accomodosa, the Accomodosa metadata standard. The other one was ELI, that you also know, European Legislation Identifier. And the third one was ECAT AP, which is a standard particularly applicable to data catalogs. Actually, what we are finally producing is a data catalog that is made available through the European Data Portal on the one hand, and on the other hand, through the ManyLaws portal that you also can access. It's of course publicly available, and by browsing through this ManyLaws portal, you will on the one hand see that we have been able to put together and make available legal data from 3 different jurisdictions, the European one, the EU one, and the Austrian and the Greek one, while at the same time and produce, for example, these quite useful working translations and produce metadata that would make it possible to compare legislation from different jurisdictions. But at the same time, we have not yet developed these specific interfaces. We have only partially introduced data from societal debates, civil society debates on legal issues. So you see, as any European project, this project would also need a follow-up project. That's what we are hoping for now, that we will be able to introduce a follow-up project after by the ManyLaws project, we have produced something that you might call a proof of concept. From the portal, you'll see that in principle it works, but to produce a marketable product, we would at least need one more project. Finally, a vision. Let me share with you a vision I have about how a future lawmaking environment might look like. A future lawmaking environment, in my opinion, will integrate, on the one hand, document processing support, the workflow support for producing, processing, amending, publishing, storing legislative documents. Procedural support by supporting the legislative procedure at the different stages, the committee stages, the plenary stages. And finally, and this now is quite a new approach, it will also integrate decision support systems, decision support services, which will be based on artificial intelligence by, on the one hand, analyzing legal conditions, legal preconditions, the legal impact that new laws will have. How will a particular piece of legislation impact the legal system? Will it, for example, have unintended consequences, which sometimes may happen? But of course, these decision support systems will also include what I would call systems based on socioeconomic modeling, systems that would support the impact assessment with regard to the societal and economic impact of new legislation. The objectives of using such a lawmaking environment, on the one hand, will of course be document quality, which is perfectly supported by the approaches that you have been discussing this week at Accomatoso, better transparency of the process, and more what has been demanded so often in public debate, evidence-based legislative decisions. The ManyLaws project, or the ManyLaws concept, demonstrates the potential of the new technologies in this particular new area. But of course, there's much work to be done in the years to come. And I hope we, or some of us, will be able to share our experiences and our workforce in working together to do this work that has to be done in the years to come. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm available for questions.
Thank you so much, Gunther, also for the last slide that is a vision. And we are very synchronized in the vision, obviously, especially on the fact that on the top of Accomatoso, we can deliver a lot of advanced tools. I'm curious to know how to integrate the vision of ManyLaws based on metadata with the content of the law, because metadata are valuable, but the law is a law. And we need to reasoning on the law and not on the metadata only. So what is your vision to integrate metadata with the content and to project the metadata in place of the document. So basically, law as a data versus law as a document.
Very true. You remember we just had a discussion in the REMAP conference at the beginning of this week about exactly that subject. That's a subject which is intensively discussed nowadays. And of course, there are several steps to be taken. One first step for sure will be to try to extract logical information from the existing laws, so to model the existing laws to a certain extent. Another step, a future step, might be perhaps to shift the paradigm towards producing legal algorithms first, and then transforming the algorithms to legal text to make them understandable to the citizens, to everyone too, in a standardized language then, of course, which might also be an advantage. This is a subject that for sure will keep us busy in the next years, or probably in the next decades. But the challenge is there. You see about the quick advance of autonomous non-human actors in the legal system, autonomous vehicles, for example, but many other autonomous actors that have to understand the rules that they have to follow too, like human beings do, and that will need algorithms to know how to act. Simply for that practical challenge, and you see how much money is invested nowadays into these technologies, simply for that practical reason, we will have to even intensify this discussion and find solutions in this decade, because in this decade, or at the end of this decade, autonomous vehicles on our streets will be reality. So we need to find the solutions in the very next years to come. Sorry, I think I've lost your audio.
Okay, thank you so much for this thought.